Thought that I'd make you a video just walking through what is going on with the selectors and the reducers so that you have a bit of an idea of what I'm talking about later on when we chat. And then this way too you can refer to it if you have questions going forward. So basically what's happening is in this scenario, when I add something here, if I just add investments, it is being stored in the reducer. So as I go add, there it is, it's showing up right up here. Now if I go into, I'll just go into my pages, income, and then I just want to go into one of my files, so control panel. I'm pretty sure that this has access, oh sorry, not income, net worth. So I'm going to go into my control panel here, and I want to console.log the reducer. So in this case, I'm pulling the reducer into this function, and how I do that, I hope that you've seen some of the reducer videos so you know what's going on here, but I do what's called a map state to props that takes state and then returns the net worth state reducer. So I can pull any reducer that I want. In this case, I just want the net worth reducer. So I'm pulling that in, passing it over to this control panel with the connect function. So I'm connecting it, map state to props. So suddenly anything that's passed in here I can access up here in its arguments that it's receiving. So I've received the net worth reducer. Now I can console log it. So if I go over to here, I'll go to the final page and console or check out my console log. So let's see. Oh, it. I'm going to turn this off too. So to the final page. So right here, you can see control panel 21. So that's the console log that I did. Now I have this state, which is my reducer. So if we look over into the actual reducer, so for net worth, I started it off with the initial state, and the initial state just has assets and liabilities, but they're both empty. Now this initial state is being passed into this function, which I call net worth reducer. This function is then passed into a magic function, which I don't know how it works, but over in the root reducer, I'm pulling in the net worth, and I'm doing this function called combine reducers. So this is combining them all into the redux state. I don't really know how that works. I just know that I need to pass in the net worth reducer into this, and now it's suddenly part of my state that permeates throughout my entire app. So if I go back to here, I started off, I just had these two objects. Now whenever I make a change, it's going to take the last state and make that change using these actions. So these are actions that I've written that either add or remove things or change the values. So in here, when we look at the state, we see that the initial state, we've got the assets and liabilities, but now we have objects stored inside of them. And then each object, the key for the object is an ID. So it's a unique ID that has been made using a math.random generator. So I've generated this random number, so that way, if I wanted to delete one, it deletes that specific one. If it was called, like, say, cash, and I deleted cash, but then there's a whole bunch of them named cash, it would delete all of them. So I need the unique ID. So now that I deleted it, when I look here, it's gone from our reducer. So this is the state that we want to be managing. Now the trouble is, we've got this state with this super complex, with our assets and then these IDs and all of this information. The problem is, over here, when it comes to our charts, we don't need all of this information, and the layout of it won't work in my chart. So I can't pass this huge object over to my chart and have the chart be able to read it and present it properly. So what I have to do is use selectors to change the data so that it fits in a specific way that will go into the chart properly. So I'll show you what the data for the chart would look like. Now in this case, I'm going to go over to the charts section. So just up into here, charts, net worth, and I've got my projection chart. Now don't worry about any of what's going on in here, but basically this is receiving data that is then creating the chart. So I'm going to console log the data. Whoops. and let's see what happens. So we'll go to the final page there. So this is the reducer. The reducer has our assets and liabilities with these individual items. But all of this information has to be converted and changed into the format that is then being presented in the chart. So down here, this is the format for the data that's showing in the chart. So the trouble is, how do I do the conversion of this huge object into this array that then has all of this information? So what's happening here, this is where the selectors come in. The selector is taking the initial state, or not the initial state, the reducer state, and then converting it into a format however I would need it. So in this case, I need it converted into this array that has a projection, so that we see here. Down here, I need the data converted so that it's in an array that shows individual items. So I'll just kind of go blah, blah, blah. But what I needed to do for this one is I had to convert, if we go into here, all of the items that have the subcategory of cash assets. I needed to convert that into an array so that they would fit neatly in here and it would show the array. So that's another example of where I'm using a selector. So what I do is when I'm trying to write a selector, usually I'll think about, I'll look at my initial data, which is this reducer, and then I'm going to think about what does it need to look like at the end. So usually, so in your case, what you'll be doing is maybe looking at this data, which is the layout of how it needs to fit in the chart. So for it to be presented in a chart, it has to have an age. Then each of these can be different. So you could have total, say total, you're doing or spending. So total house spending or total vehicle spending. And so you could have those different categories. So you can change those names, but they each need to be connected to age, because age is the one that's running along the bottom, and that's our x-axis. So when we go into so we'll start here. I'm just going to look at the net worth reducer. So we go in here, we've got our initial state, and then we've got our actions that change the state. In the selectors, this is where it looks a little overwhelming with the amount of code that I have going on here. But what I'm doing is basically converting the different layouts. So I'm converting the object to give me, in this case, I just want all the cash items. So what I've done here is I've written a formula that takes a category and a subcategory. So in this case, the category would be assets and the subcategory would be cash assets. Then it's running an object.values on the category. So object.values converts it to an array. And then it's just checking to see if there's actually an array there. If not, it'll just return null. Then it's filtering through that array and giving me everything that meets the subcategory, which in this case is cash assets. So what I did right here with the cash selector is I passed in networth.assets and cash assets. Now the cash selector is this neat little array. So let's just go into, let's see if I can find where it would be presented so that we can see it. So if we go into net worth, I think it's in the item display box that we have our selectors. No. Networth.js. Where am I passing in the... Sorry, I'm just looking. So what I'm looking for is the selector that is giving me this little array, which is the cash assets, which is what I've done by writing that selector. So let's just go back into here and I'll just do a search for it. So the cash selector. Oh, looks like I'm only using it there. So that's a bad example. Maybe what I'll do is I'll discuss or the property names selector. So this one I know. So what I needed here was I needed to convert this whole state, and I needed to go through and look at every asset. So if I call a property asset here, I'll just say house, and its primary residence, blah, blah, blah. So I needed to go through the state and find every instance where the category was property asset, and then I had to create an array of the names so that later, if I go into liabilities and then add a secure debt, I needed those names to show up here. So if I go, let's just go back over to this one. I'm going to go, oops, I can't do this. There we go. Into assets. So I'm going to just show you, this is Crazy House. So you can see how the weird name that I put in here shows up over in the liability section. So I add that. Now when I go into liabilities, and if I want to add a secured debt, I needed the array that shows me Crazy House. So in order to convert the state over to this array that gives me these different things, that's where I used a selector. So the selector that I wrote, first let me console log it. So I'm going to go, I think it was property names. So it's in the add income file. I don't know why it does this two screen thing. It's kind of annoying. Okay, so back up over to here. So the add form. And then we've got the property name selector. So I'm just going to console log that so you can see what the final result looks like. Property name selector. So here you go. So now I just have this little neat array that says house and Crazy House. So those are the two things that are stored in my state. I took that gigantic object and just converted it to be this little array. So the way that I did that was, if we go into the selectors, so I'm going to go net worth selectors. Initially, what you have to do is grab the net worth reducer. So the net worth reducer, I just call it net worth reducer, and it takes state and state.networth reducer. So this is coming from the magic root reducer in here, this magic combine reducers function, which I don't know how it works, but that's where it's coming from. Then when I wanted to create, so anytime I create a selector, I'm passing in the entire state, which is this entire thing. And then the way that I'm doing that, let me just show you over here. I think maybe in the add form is where I do it. So in the same map state to props, I've called in my reducer, or the selector, sorry. So the selector has been pulled in from up here. Let me just see, property name selector. So I've called this in from the selectors. Now in map state to props, I'm putting in the selector, and this is where that selector is getting passed state. So the entire state has now been passed to this selector. So now when I go over into net worth selectors, when this happens, it's saying net worth reducer equals state. So we got the entire state because all of it was passed to there. And then state.networth reducer. So now I have that specific net worth reducer. So I'm just working on that specific piece of the overall total state. So that's, if we go over here, that's how I grab the net worth reducer state. So right here, this object, that's how I grabbed this object, by passing in the state. So I've got the net worth reducer. Now I don't know how the create selector function works, but it's a function that takes something like this, net worth reducer. So for the property name selector, I go export const property name selector. So I just name them all so that they have selector at the end. That way I can just differentiate my different types of formulas. Then I do create selector. I'm passing in the net worth reducer. Now what I want to do is convert this state, this whole thing, into a tiny array that just shows me these two items. So usually what I'll do when I wanted to write a formula like that, I won't play around too much with this console. I'll open up a new window and do a new file. Maybe just, yeah, let's try this. Just call it net worth selectors, whoops, .js. Oops, that didn't work. Okay, I'm gonna open up another folder. I'm gonna go into here. So in my folders, I just have one that I call functions, and it's just got all these random functions. And this is where I play around just locally in my local environment. That way I can do my my formulas a little easier. So I'll just put net worth selector .js. So I will pause here and then upload another video where I walk through what I'm going to be doing here.